Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed.
Today, my guest is Laura Ebke, Senior Fellow at the Platt Institute in Nebraska. Laura is a former state senator, former school board member, and a avid political consumer and sort of just political junkie like me and like all of us over here at Ballotpedia. So very excited to talk to Laura about Nebraska and some interesting data that she recently wrote about. So we're going to tell you listeners about Nebraska for a little bit first, and then I'll let Laura fill in the gaps of what I missed. Nebraska is the only state senate that is unicameral. It's also the only state with a officially nonpartisan state legislature. When voters go to the polls, they see nonpartisan on the ballot. It's the only state that does that for the state legislature. However, everyone within the state house knows pretty much where all of those state legislators do caucus. Everyone kind of knows who the D's are and who the R's are. And some actually are independents. So Nebraska is a really interesting state. We're going to have a little bit of fun talking about it. And Laura, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Okay, so what did I miss? Walk us through Nebraska's political structure. How does that nonpartisan legislature work?
Yeah, you didn't miss much. I mean, the historical context is important because George Norris, former U.S. senator and from Nebraska, really promoted the unicameral legislature back in the late 30s. And he went around the state. The story is that he went around the state, wore out, I don't know, 4 sets of tires, driving around the state to promote this, and then got
Yeah.
the Constitution changed because we did have a bicameral legislature. And he believed, based on his experience in D.C., that partisan legislatures and bicameral legislatures were a bad thing because you had the danger of the conference committees and the influence of interest groups and so forth in those. So that's kind of the historical context. For most of our history, we've been modestly nonpartisan. I mean, you run as a nonpartisan, even though you're registered as a Republican or a Democrat or a Libertarian or whatever,
Mhm.
but you still you don't show up as a partisan on the ballot, and so it's always we have a primary. Sometimes there's 5 or 6 people in the primary, and the top 2 move through, and doesn't matter what their party is.
Yeah, and what's so interesting with that is, we see this in so many different states. Once you've had a certain system for a long time, it kind of becomes like baked into the culture of that location. So I would imagine that Nebraska's had the system for so long that for people who live there and experience it, it's sort of like how in New Hampshire they have 400 members of the state house,
Yeah.
and that's their system. They love it. They've had that for a long time, and people don't usually want to change something that they already have.
Yeah, I grew up here in Nebraska, and my parents were born after the change, and they grew up here in Nebraska, and so people who are in their 80s and 90s don't remember anything before.
Yeah.
And so those of us who are younger, I mean, we learn about it in 4th grade history, and Nebraska history and so forth. So I think that yes, it's hard to imagine something else. And when I lived briefly in Tennessee and North Carolina while my husband was in the military, um, you know, thinking about the fact that there were 2 houses in a legislature just seemed weird.
Yeah.
And so you get used to it for sure. And there's always some
Mm.
effort because our capital has 2 chambers baked in, and the second one isn't used, obviously, but except for ceremonial things. But and every once in a while, you'll have somebody say, "Well, it'd be better if we were like everybody else," and all this sort of stuff, and it never gains much traction. So,
Yeah. So to sort of dig a little more into Nebraska, you did a little report recently, and kind of walk us through it. It talked about party registration and sort of the history behind that and what's been changing. So, what did you find, just sort of broad overviews in that report?
sure. Well, this is just Nebraska, although it is consistent with what's happening nationwide. I think just at a little different scale. But Nebraska is a pretty red state, and what we found is that over time, I went back to the territorial days almost, at least the
Hmm.
early 1900s, And what we found is that partisan identification for most of our history in Nebraska was roughly level, Republicans and Democrats in terms of who would get the vote. 1972, we actually went to a closed primary system and started registering, requiring people or asking people to register as a partisan or nonpartisan. And even in 72, there were more Republicans, but not that many more Republicans. And what's happened, and not very many nonpartisans because it was a closed primary.
Hmm.
What's happened in the last 15 to 20 years is that you've had a great divergence. A lot of people are now registering as nonpartisans. And fewer people are registering as Democrats. People are leaving the Democratic Party in Nebraska. Republican registration has stayed roughly level, right around 40, between 47 and 49% of the registered voters are Republicans in the state. And what's interesting is, I think, is that in the next election cycle or two, we could have a situation where nonpartisans make up a higher percentage of the voting population than do Democrats. So
Yeah. Yeah, and to your point, it's something that has been seen in other states as well. How does it work with the state senate then? So if you have a nonpartisan general election, is there one primary? Is it a closed primary where there actually are nominations? How does that work?
yeah, everybody gets to vote in that's the one. Well, that, and then, of course, our municipal elections and school board elections are all nonpartisan as well, and so we have kind of this broad history of, lower level nonpartisanship and then the legislative race. So everybody gets a ballot in the primary, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you get the nonpartisan ballot as well
Right.
that has all of those things. And, we have one primary, and everybody gets to vote in it for the legislature, and the top 2 move through to the general election. Doesn't
Mm,
matter what their doesn't matter what their formal party affiliation is. In fact, it's fairly common in Nebraska just because of the number of Republicans in the state that you'll have 2 Republicans move through, or in some districts, especially in the metro areas, 2 Democrats will move
right.
through, and so it's it doesn't seem to bother us too much for the legislature.
Yeah, you hear a lot about California's top two system, but you kind of people often forget that Nebraska actually has its own version of that as well. And you see the same thing in California sometimes, where certain districts will have two Ds or two Rs advanced. Um, but again, what's kind of interesting is you have this nonpartisan system in the state senate, but when voters go to the polls same day for a congressional race, they are going to actually be in a closed primary system. I think is that right for Nebraska? So they're going to vote based on their party affiliation. Is that right?
Right, that's right, and also for the governor's race and the attorney generals, all the other constitutional officers at the
Right.
state level. So, yeah, it's a closed primary for that. Nebraska has sort of a it's a closed slash semi-closed because, the parties can allow nonpartisans to vote in their primary if
Mm,
they have to stipulate that they're going to. The only party that does that is the Democrats do that mostly, I think, because their numbers have decreased so much, and they're hoping that the nonpartisans will come over and, provide them with some oomph.
right. Yeah, it's so interesting because I mean that the actual definitions and wording you use for closed and semi-closed and open and top two and top four, we talk a lot about that at Ballotpedia because the definitions can often be used in different ways. I mean, for instance, even the word jungle primary
Mhm.
is used quite a bit and often means a different thing depending on who's using it and in what context. So we've got quite a bit written up on Ballotpedia about the different terminology used to describe our sort of primary nomination system. Um, and you mentioned in your research people temporarily switching parties to vote in certain primaries, in particular Republican ones. And what did that look like? What did you find there?
Well, what we find is that right before the primaries, you tend to have a bump in the registration amongst Republicans and a decrease amongst Democrats and nonpartisans, and a
Mhm.
lot of times those back out after the primary. Anecdotally, I have a lot of friends who are Democrats, who have said that they've changed their registration so that they could go decide who is, have a vote in who's going to be governor, because it's sort of it's an assumption that whoever wins the Republican primary will be
Yeah.
the next governor. And so that's where most of the action is.
Yep.
And so people will make that switch for the primary so that they can actually go vote in the contest.
Yeah, I mean, you see the same thing in a place like New York City where, you'll have Republicans or libertarians who will say, I'm a registered Democrat because I want to participate in the primary that ultimately is going to likely result in the winner of the general election. And, we've been writing about this in state legislatures for a long time, that typically about 40% of the general election seats have only one major party candidate. And that's
Mhm.
7,300 state legislators, and about 40% of them, there's only one major party candidate on the ballot. If that's the case, then really the primary is essentially the place where voters can say, this is who I support. And so, to your point, if it's a closed primary type situation, you're going to have voters register just for the opportunity.
Right.
Um,
I think the other thing that's important to remember, is that, I mean, and this is just purely anecdotal, just based on what friends have told me, is that they look at the, Republican or Democrats or nonpartisans look at the choices amongst the Republican candidates, and it's sort of a protection kind of thing, because they see somebody who might be um, more strident in their approach, to things,
Mhm.
and they aren't as keen about that. So what they're trying to do is to increase the chances that a somewhat more moderate candidate might make it through the primary system. So I think that's an important thing to, at least keep in the back of your mind as far as the primary switching goes.
yeah. What are some of the pros and cons that you've seen put forth by those who are, there's always different policy reforms being proposed in this space, either from political parties, from the voters themselves, or even from the election administrators who have to, run and oversee these elections. So, what are some of those typical arguments that are being put forth?
Well, I mean, I mean, you've got financial arguments,
Hmm.
from the standpoint, we're all paying for the primaries, and so the parties aren't paying for the primaries, and in Nebraska, when you have 25% of the voters almost that are nonpartisan, they're paying for primaries that they don't get a voice in, and so that's sort of the kind of bottom line for a lot of nonpartisans. Um, I think that, practically speaking, you could reduce the cost of primary elections by having one ballot if you went to a top two kind of thing. And certainly the ballots for Nebraska legislature and the nonpartisan seats are cheaper, because you don't have to print two different versions for different
Hmm.
parties, or three in Nebraska, because libertarians have a primary ballot too.
Yep.
Um, and then I think that, I mean, but then on the other side of things, partisans, especially Republican partisans right now, say, why should somebody who doesn't align with us be able to choose who our candidate is? And so you have sort of this balancing act between sort of the pragmatic and financial aspect of it, and the purpose of the parties. Parties are supposed to run candidates, who represent their values and all this sort of stuff. And if somebody else gets to come in and who isn't aligned with them, and decide who the party's candidate is, that could be problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. And, kind of harking back to the point about Nebraska's unicameral legislature being around for a while and people don't know anything differently. Most Americans don't realize that primaries have not been around like this forever.
Right.
There was a time period where you didn't nominate a candidate through essentially an election, a state-run election, um, and that's particularly interesting. As a lot of national press has covered Elon Musk's comments in the last few weeks about starting a new political party. Well, that's very complicated, actually, and
Right.
it's a state by state thing. It's one thing to say I'm going to create a national political party. It's another thing to go get ballot qualified in the 50 states. It's another thing to figure out how to run candidates in the 50 states. And is there a convention? Are you going to use a primary election?
Right.
It's really complicated, actually, right?
Right. And I think probably the last really successful new party was Ross Perot's,
Hmm.
back in '92.
Yep.
in '96, and I mean, he had a lot of money behind it. He also had a certain level of uh, angst, I guess, amongst the population. But where is the Reform Party now? And so, I mean, that's one of the, where's the staying power of some of these parties, and so they can kind of be a flash in the, flash in the pan. So.
Yeah. Yeah. It'd be very interesting to see how that actually all plays out. What are some other states that you maybe heard of or come across that are grappling with similar questions about the changing dynamics of independent voters and nonpartisan voters as it relates to the system? Anywhere stand out in particular?
I don't know that any particularly stand out to me. I mean, you're probably better you're probably better familiar with that than I am. But I mean, certainly any state that is extremely blue or extremely red is going to have to deal with that, because especially if they've got a closed primary system. You
Yeah.
know, not every state has a closed primary, and a lot of states, you know the numbers better than I do, I'm sure, but roughly half maybe have a closed primary of some sort, and then the others let people in some manner to vote.
Yep.
Either vote, and some don't even register by party, and that's one of the problems that you have, is because every state has their own election rules and registration rules. I mean, you have to be 18, but beyond that, what's the way that you register? And really, Nebraska didn't start registering people as partisans until 72. And so it's a little bit tough to, you look at things, you have to look at secondary sources. So in the paper, I looked at, Pew Research and Gallup polls and things like that, and how people identified themselves. And,
Mm,
a lot of people are identifying themselves as, not affiliated or nonpartisans, even if are kind of forced into registering someplace.
yeah. Yeah. It certainly has been continuing the trend in this direction, as you identified in your paper, and uh, will be it'll be very fascinating to see how this plays out in our continuing election cycle. So, any last words that you wanted to get out from your
Yeah, I
paper?
mean, I think the generational replacement theory stuff is I think fascinating. It was big when I was in
Mhm.
graduate school, just kind of coming out, in a big way then. And if you look at the numbers, people, I'm 63, people my age and older, um, don't, are pretty well set in our ways. We don't move around, and we know that, and all the vote studies show that people have a tendency to register the way that their parents were. I mean, it's not universal, but, people tend to go in the same direction that their parents did.
Mhm.
But now you've got a whole new generation of people who, who are under 30 or under 35, who are having kids. And, I think that the move towards nonpartisanship will probably increase, because you look at those younger age groups, and there are more and more of them who are nonpartisan. So as that next generation's kids come around, they will feel less connected to a particular party, I think.
Mm. Yeah, that's very interesting. It ties into the whole departure from institutions that there have been a lot of studies about in the country. So, very interesting. Thanks for sharing all of that today, Laura. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
For our listeners, you can learn more about elections, about primaries, nonpartisan issues, voter registration, everything else at the links in our show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Pelley, and thanks for listening.